So I'm going to be presenting today some research that my colleagues and I published on Monday about children's learning experiences through COVID. And there are essentially three main questions we seek to answer in this research. One, how did the experiences of English school children evolve throughout the pandemic? So both during the first and second nationwide school closures and during the 2020 autumn term that interspersed them. The idea of this is to provide a sort of panoramic viewpoint of how children coped during the first year of disruption. We also look at how did socioeconomic learning inequalities between the richest and poorest children evolve during the pandemic. And finally, I'm going to talk about what the lessons from these sections imply about the design of catch-up policies going forward. And the way we answer these questions is we administered two surveys of parents of English school children during two key stages of the pandemic. So the first wave survey was administered in April and May 2020, which coincided with the first national lockdown and the first round of nationwide school closures. We then administered a second survey in February and March of this year, which coincided with the third national lockdown and the second round of nationwide school closures. And in the second wave survey, we also asked recall questions about the autumn term here. And as I said, the sort of rationale for this was to get a more comprehensive overview of experiences throughout the pandemic. In total, we surveyed around 11,400 parents, different sets of parents each time, and broadly the same number of parents between both waves. We asked parents questions related to how long their children were spending on different learning activities. And we asked these via sliding scale questions, like the one I've pasted at the bottom of the slide here. So in a typical week, how many hours was your child spending on these different learning activities? We also asked questions about the type of learning resources they had available at home, like computers and laptops, and also asked about questions about resources that have been provided by their school, such as learning packs or online classes. So to move to the first section on total learning experiences, this is kind of a headline graph which shows how weekly total learning time evolved between the first round of nationwide closures and the second, and how these compare to pre-pandemic benchmarks. And we measured these pre-pandemic benchmarks using the 2014-15 UK time use survey. And what we see is that before the pandemic, both primary and secondary school children spent around 35 hours per week on learning activities. This fell quite dramatically during the first round of school closures, with both primary and secondary children learning about 22 hours per week. But then we see in the second round of closures, this recovered somewhat. So primary school children began learning around 26 hours per week, and secondary school children, the recovery was greater, so around 29 hours per week. We kind of hypothesized two major reasons for this recovery. The first, most obvious one is that obviously by the second round, parents, children, and schools had time to sort of get used to distance learning and could learn what were the most effective strategies and make sure they were in place for the second round of closures to enable a smoother transition. And the second reason is that the government set down much clearer guidelines about what remote learning should look like. So they imposed sort of minimum standards for daily learning time for different key stages in the education system. While this recovery is encouraging, it's worth noting that the learning time in the second closures is still substantially below what it was pre-pandemic. So this kind of goes to show the sort of sheer extent of learning loss that I think the pandemic has inflicted, which is a point I'm going to return to in the final section when we talk about catch-up policies. When we disaggregate total learning time by its component parts, we see that most of this recovery came from the fact that children spent more time in online classes. So we see here that during the first round of school closures, primary school children spent about 8 hours per week in online classes. This rose to about 14 hours per week in the second round of closures. And for secondary school kids, it rose from around 11 hours per week to around 19 hours per week. And the main reason for this is that schools were much more likely to offer online classes during the second round of closures. So that's both live and recorded online classes. And at the primary level, it sort of went from around 40% of kids having access to them to around 67% of kids, whereas at the secondary level, it went from around 52% of kids having access to about 87%. And I think this sort of fits into the narrative I gave before, that schools were much better able to, well, they adapted much better to the second round of closures. And they transitioned towards resources that sort of parents and children sort of responded better to, and transitioned away from these passive provisions here. So passive provisions include things like physical learning packs and emails. We also look at what happened during the autumn term. And while we don't have learning time estimates for this period, we do have estimates of how many days of in-school provision children lost as a result of isolation. So obviously during autumn, schools were open to all pupils, but were periodically disrupted by both student and staff self-isolation. And we see that on average, children lost about 8 days of in-person schooling, and about 30% of kids lost 2 weeks or over. On average, secondary school kids lost slightly more schooling. I think the best reason for this is that the government had a mandate, they sort of mandated lateral flow testing in secondary schools, which led to high rates of detection, which led to high rates of isolation. So to sort of summarize section 1, we see that learning time recovered in between the 2 phases of nationwide school closures, but that even the second round, learning time remained substantially below pre-pandemic levels. We see that most of the recovery came from increased time spent in online classes. And finally, we show that sort of learning loss continues during, or likely continued during the autumn term, as children continue to lose out on in-school provision as a result of self-isolation. Moving on to inequalities, this graph here shows pretty much the first graph I just showed you, but disaggregated by children in the poorest and richest 20% of households. And what we can see that before the pandemic, there was no observable learning time gaps at the primary level, at least, between children in the richest and 20% households. So they both spent about 35 hours per week on learning activities. At the secondary level, there were learning gaps, but they were relatively, well, they were less substantial than what we see later. So the poorest 20% of kids spent about 35 hours per week on learning, whereas the richest spent about 39 hours per week. This changed dramatically during the first round of school closures. So we see at both the primary and secondary school level, children in the poorest 20% of households spent about 19 hours per week on learning activities, whereas those in the richest 20% of households spent around 27 hours per week on learning activities. This is really quite a substantial difference. It's almost 50% more. So yeah, I think massive sort of inequalities emerged, and previous research of ours basically argued that the sort of main drivers of these inequalities were that richer kids were much more likely to have access to things like tablets and laptops in which they could access online resources. And they also attended schools that were much more likely to provide things like online classes, which helped them sort of keep up with their learning. The encouraging thing is these learning gaps diminished by the second round of closures, as both sort of richest and poorest students spent about the same amount of time learning. Actually, the poorest kids spent slightly more at primary level, but these differences aren't significant. And we basically show that the drivers of this catch-up was much the same as what I just said. So poorer kids were much more likely to have access to computers and tablets in the second round of closures, and the schools they attended were much more likely to sort of increase their provision from online classes. So overall, the distribution of online classes became much more equitable as the pandemic progressed. I think this is encouraging, but just before I move on from this slide, it's worth noting that these inequalities that emerged during the first closure, these aren't likely to have gone away. They're likely to have sort of long-lasting effects. And to sort of overcome them, it may not be enough for sort of parity. Well, it's probably not enough for parity to be restored. Poorer kids need to start doing sort of above and beyond what their richer peers to make up for the ground they lost upon them in the early stages of the pandemic. We also look at inequalities during the autumn term, and this looks at the average number of days that school children lost at both the primary and secondary school level, disaggregated by earnings quintiles. And we basically see that poorer kids, on average, lost out on more days of in-person schooling, particularly at the primary level. So the poorest 20% of kids lost about 8 days of schooling, compared to about 6.5 days for the middle and richest 20% of kids. The reasons for this, we hypothesize, is first, we know that sort of COVID rates were disproportionately higher amongst poorer communities. And also, poorer kids are more likely to be in schools with higher pupil-classroom ratios. When you've got more kids in the classroom, you're probably going to have more isolations per positive case because there's more children that have been in contact with them. So this is sort of not very encouraging, and it's actually worse than this, because not only are poorer kids more likely to have to isolate during autumn, they'd also had less access to things like online classes when they were forced to do so. So we see at the primary level, during isolation periods in autumn, the poorest 20% of kids only about sort of 30% of them had access to online classes, compared to sort of 35% of the richest kids. And then at the secondary level, around 35% of the poorest 20%, compared to around sort of 42% of the richest kids. So overall, I think there's evidence that the poorer kids fared worse during the 2020 autumn term, both because they were more likely to have to isolate and had less resources available when doing so. And I think this is a really important point, because this model of in-school provision with periodic disruption has now characterized the majority of the pandemic, including since March 2021, which is when our survey ended. So if these patterns continued sort of from March onwards, it may be the case that inequalities are basically worsened since March 2021. Finally, what do these messages imply about the design of catch-up policies? Before I turn to this, I just want to try and contextualize some of the learning loss statistics that I presented previously. It's obviously very hard to get at learning loss without test scores. But one way we can try and sort of measure this is ask parents about how long they think it will take to their children to catch up on the learning they've lost. And overall, this graph paints a pretty sobering picture. So around over 30% of parents think it'll take their child a school year or more to catch up. And it's worth emphasizing that this question was asked in March of 2021. So this doesn't account for any learning loss that might have happened since then. There's also a concerning fraction of parents down here who think their child will never be able to catch up. And in this regard, secondary school parents are slightly more pessimistic than primary school parents, probably because they have less sort of school years left in which they can make up for lost ground. So obviously these sort of massive learning losses have strong implications on the rollout of catch-up policies. And we documented these in March 2021 to try and get an early indication of some of the patterns that were emerging and whether these had any implications on some of the inequalities we've documented. So what this graph shows is both the percentage of children that were offered catch-up tuition and the percentage of children that were doing catch-up tuition in March. And the way to read this graph is you read the sort of top of the bars to look at the percent that were offered, and read the top of the dark green bars to look at the percent that were doing. And to take sort of both sort of components of it in turn, we see that in terms of percent offered, there's a U-shaped relationship. So both the poorest and richest 20% of kids were the most likely to have catch-up tuition offered to them. And I think this highlights a risk that children in the middle of the income distribution might be forgotten about going forward, because they're not sort of poor enough to qualify for additional government support, but they also don't attend schools that are sort of affluent enough to put on catch-up resources themselves. The second key message of this graph is that we see when catch-up policies are made voluntary, socioeconomic gradients are exacerbated. So to sort of best illustrate this, if you compare the richest and poorest 20% of kids, they were both sort of equally likely to be offered catch-up tuition. But because richer parents were much more likely to voluntarily take this up, we see that the richest 20% of kids were 5 percentage points more likely to be actually doing it in March. And the key message here, that if you make catch-up policies voluntary, this may exacerbate learning inequalities. So that's a key message that we kind of emphasize in our report going forward. I'm going to finish here, but just before I do, I'm just going to flag some future work. There's a sort of body of work at the IFS that's all using this time use data. One thing we're going to do about education is for a subset of our sample, we have parental consent to link the data for their child to the National Pupil Database. So we can look at some of their GCSE outcomes, for example, sort of later down the line. So that should be able to sort of let us better measure the sort of extent and distribution of learning loss across kids that had different experiences of COVID and lockdowns. And the final thing I'll mention is, because I know we have a session on mental health in the afternoon, we also collected a module on socio-emotional measures. So we also have a paper in the pipeline on adult and child mental well-being, which is very early stage, but hopefully we'll make some progress with it towards the end of this year. That's everything. And yeah, I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Adam. So we have 4 minutes for questions, actually. Thanks very much for the excellent timing of the talk. So let's do what we did in the previous session, that who has question can either raise their hand, or if there isn't a crowd of people, then you can just